Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me. My name's Alex Mustonen, and I'm a co-founder and partner of Snarkitecture, and we're a collaborative creative practice based in New York. What I want to do today is talk about our practice, but more importantly, talk about our goals and why we're doing it. And just as a sort of setup for the talk, I think when we started Snarkitecture, one of our primary goals was this idea about making architecture perform the unexpected. So taking things that we recognize as familiar from our built environment, our surroundings, and reinterpreting them into something new that would be unexpected. But what I want to talk a little bit as we go through some of the work that we've created is how that goal has evolved into using this idea about manipulating or reimagining architecture as a tool for creating spaces, environments, moments that are accessible, engaging to a really wide and diverse audience. So most importantly, how people interact with and engage with architecture and how people interact and engage with one another within our spaces. Start with this image, which we'll come back to in a moment. But the Snarkitecture story in some ways starts here. This is a school in New York called Cooper Union that I attended. I went to school for architecture there. And my co-founder of Snarkitecture, Daniel Arsham, went to school here for visual art. And in some ways, the seed or genesis for our practice is really in the model or goal of this school, which is a small school that's focused on collaborative working between disciplines, art, architecture, and engineering. It's a free school, which is very unusual in the States, or let's say it was free until recently, which is another story. But in any case, Daniel and I went there in the early 2000s, and the art and architecture floors were just one floor apart, and they shared a space which was a wood shop. It was a fabrication shop for the architecture students would build models, and the sculpture students would build sculptures there. And out of that shared sensibility, somehow the architects and the sculptors had this kind of relationship. And so Daniel and I were friends, and we also had mutual friends. But most importantly, I think, since the beginning, since we started studying there, had an interest in each other's disciplines, which is to say that I always had a keen interest in art, and Daniel's work at the time was actually exploring architecture, sort of from the perspective of the artist. We worked together a little bit while we were in school, and shortly after graduating, we worked on a project together that I was consulting for a project of Daniel's. He had already started a fine art practice and had been commissioned to create a large-scale installation of his work in Los Angeles, actually. And during the course of that project, we spent about 9 months working together in communication, and during that, we talked about this idea about starting not just a one-off project or one-off collaboration, but a continued, sustained collaboration between art and architecture, between our respective backgrounds in those disciplines. And somehow this came up, which is The Hunting of the Snark, which is a poem written by Lewis Carroll, who's from Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, etc. But one of the first things we talked about in starting a collaborative practice, this joint venture, is what do we call it? And for some reason, the word Snarkitecture was something that was entering into our conversation, and it was a little bit of a nonsense word. It's a word that doesn't exist. It was something that sort of, yes? Oh, sorry, yes. So Snarkitecture was a little bit of a portmanteau coming from this invented word that Lewis Carroll made up called the snark, and obviously architecture. So for us, it was a little bit of a pun. It was something that was humorous. It was something that was memorable, but it was something that was playing with the idea of what architecture is and what it could be. So this book, in addition to being the origin of the title, Snarkitecture, is also a little bit of a metaphor or a description of how we view the practice. This image that you saw at the beginning is the ocean chart that the explorers in the book are using. So the poem tells the story of this crew of misfits on a search for this unknown creature called the snark, and they don't know what it is or how to find it or what to do with it when they do find it. But so it's an improbable story of the impossible story of an improbable crew to find an inconceivable creature. And it's this idea of the inconceivable, the unknown, that we're interested in finding within art and design and architecture. And so this map, the blank ocean chart, is a little bit of a journey into the unknown. It's a sort of a formless path. I want to give a little bit of background just into the studio itself, which is a really important part of our practice. It's a practice that we set up as a collaborative environment, a space that we drew from our experience in art studios, architecture studios. And this is the first space we had, which was in Greenpoint, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn. And it was a small little industrial building that we got in 2008, and we set up our first studio here. This is a collaboration we did with the artist JR a couple years after that, literally combining two of our projects into an image that was pasted onto the front. But this is what it looked like inside, which was, in my view, sort of just a controlled chaos, which is to say a space of experimentation, but also one that reflected a kind of sensibility of the practice, and that it was somewhat organized, but had some unexpected moments within it as well. And then about 3 years ago, we moved to a new space, and this is the space at the beginning of the, before we renovated it, but it's in Long Island City, which is just in Queens, just the next neighborhood over in New York. And we tried to keep the same idea of an open space, a space for discussion, collaboration, a space for really playing with architecture. So the studio is actually divided. What you're seeing here in this image is the Snarkitecture part of the studio. And in addition to our collaboration as Snarkitecture, Daniel maintains his own art practice as a fine artist as well. So you see some of his work installed in the studio, and you also see Snarkitecture's work and installations scattered about. Drawing, sketching, concepts, these are the most important part of what we do. Is what's the idea, what's the concept of a project that we work on. So our work usually starts even before this just with discussion, with talking between the partners, between everybody in the studio. Again, it's a very collaborative process, and then we're generating lots of drawings, sketches before we go into the computer working. So here's the three of us. Daniel's in the middle, and then on the right is, or sorry, on the right side is Ben Porta, who's our third partner, who joined us in 2015, who brought with him a sort of his own wealth of experience in architecture as we were sort of growing the practice into a larger scale. So I'm just going to look at sort of a select group of Snarkitecture projects and talk a little bit about how not only the projects came to be and sort of what they're about, but really about, again, how these projects relate back to this idea about creating spaces, objects, et cetera, that are accessible, engaging, interactive for a really wide and diverse audience. One of our goals is to bring as many people to the conversation, as many people to the table as we can. I think a lot of times we think of architecture as being something that's quite serious, it's quite weighty. I think the same sort of limitations that people have about viewing art, they often think of as a limitation with architecture as well. It's something that's meant to be within or looked at and not necessarily engaged with, or a sort of a tactile, immersive environment. This was a project that was a public artwork that was in Miami, Florida. We were commissioned to do this project for a new baseball stadium that was being built there, which was on the site of this building, which was the Miami Orange Bowl. So this was an old stadium that was built in the 30s in Miami, and it was quite famous for hosting the Miami Hurricanes football team. But they tore it down in 2006 to make way for this new stadium. So when we were commissioned to create this sculpture for the plaza in front of the stadium, rather than creating a kind of an iconic single object, I think we knew from the start that we were very interested in creating more of an environment, something that would take over and inhabit more of the plaza. And what we wanted to work with was something that was already there. In this case, the letters were such an obvious kind of choice for us. This really simple, almost generic kind of font that was created when the stadium was built that says Miami Orange Bowl. Here's the stadium being torn down. Here's the new one under construction. And so our project is over here on the east side of the stadium, along this kind of long plaza. So we took those 15 letters of the Miami Orange Bowl sign, and we looked at recreating them, bringing them back to life. But rather than letting them sit upright, we looked at submerging them, burying them, putting them into different states of different conditions that would appear as if they were either sinking or being excavated. And so here they are being constructed. They're made from reinforced concrete and sort of, again, scattered about the plaza. And so what happens is sort of two things. One is they no longer say Miami Orange Bowl, so that we've sort of removed the meaning of the original while still referencing this very familiar bright orange original version. You're creating new meanings and new sort of combinations or interactions as you move around the space or approach the stadium. But they also appear as if they are in a sort of an archaeological excavation, a sort of a ruin of the past stadium that's being unearthed, or almost as if the letters had fallen off of the stadium and sort of scattered themselves into the ground. But beyond the visual kind of component of this project was this idea of positioning the letters in ways that would invite and encourage sort of unprogrammed interactions. So basically allowing people to inhabit these things and climb them and, for that matter, skateboard them was a really sort of interesting and surprisingly open process with the city. They were very willing to sort of let us put these things out there as spaces that, you know, they create seating, they create standing, they create sort of moments to even climb and explore. Pillow is a project that represents the sort of opposite end of the scale of the spectrum that we work on, which is to say very large projects to very small projects. But this is a little object that was sort of just an experiment that came out of sort of material testing and ideas that we were working on in the studio at the time. So it's a very simple object. It holds your phone, or at least the first one did. And it appears soft, but is actually quite hard. It's made from cast gypsum, so it's poured into a mold. And there's something about this idea about playing with expectations that we find very compelling. Seeing something as one way, but in fact, whether it's by walking around or by picking it up or by touching it, that you understand it in another way. So this idea that a direct and tactile immersion creates this kind of human connection and creates this, translates the idea of the unexpected into something that becomes memorable. It's something that stays with you. What we did after creating this, these are all the sort of phone versions. So when the idea was, it's an object that only has one function. It does one thing, which is to hold your phone. When your phone's not in it, you know that it must be somewhere else. After we made this, we set up shop in a kind of a satellite studio at the New Museum in New York for a weekend and invited people to bring their own objects. So you could bring whatever you wanted, and we would turn it into a pillow, or rather create a pillow for that object. So again, objects that have a single function, sort of focusing into this, really the core of what this thing was about. Split is a furniture piece. This came out of a larger series of furniture studies that we were doing several years ago. This idea about excavating, about cutting away, is something that we've returned to. It's something we continue to explore. There's a number of reasons I think we're interested in this, but in this case, there's this sense that the object is either being put back together or sort of being wrenched apart. It's an object that exists in a sort of a frozen moment. It's also something that appears to be broken, but is in fact functional, but because there's no direct or apparent function when you approach it, but it's something that's scaled so as to be a stool or an end table, but again, a kind of a programless object in a way. The beach is a kind of an in-between project in the sense that it's not permanent, but it's quite large. And it represents this kind of installation side of our work, which is we think about in these kind of three parallel paths of object, installation, and then architectural scale projects. The beach was a project that was originally commissioned in 2015 by the National Building Museum in Washington, D.C. And it's a museum that's quite literally about building. It's you know, in some ways more of almost a trade museum about construction, more so than a design or architecture museum, but they do touch on both ends of this. And what we were tasked with was creating a project that would fill the space, which is the Great Hall, which is this incredible atrium within the museum. It's a historic building in Washington, D.C. And the goal for the project from the museum was to create a project that would exist for the summer months in DC, be inviting and friendly to families and tourists and design enthusiasts and everybody in between. And DC in the summer is a very hot and humid place, and in discussing which angle or which approach we should take with this project, we talked a little bit about the idea of a space that would be comfortable, that would be inviting, family-friendly, associated with summer. And the idea of the beach was just something that felt very universal to us. It felt like something that everybody could relate to and everybody would know. But what we were interested in is bringing that inside and making an indoor version of it. And at the same time, we were interested in these, which are these ball pool balls, which, you know, I think everyone knows from a kind of childhood playground or childhood experience of jumping into this pool of balls. But we were thinking about this object or this material at an architectural scale. So instead of 1 or 100 or 1,000 of them, 1,000,000 of them. And what would it look like if we filled a space, if we flooded an environment with them and allowed it to kind of infill the architecture of the space. And so this was what the first version of this project looked like. It was a very simple structure. It was an enclosure that we built within the atrium of the museum. And in this image, you kind of get a sense of what the project is about, which is taking these things that are familiar moments from the beach-going experience and translating them into this new palette, this new all monochromatic environment. And what that does is it puts people in relief, meaning when you walk into that space, you become the most important thing in the space. And it's also an environment that's very much about collective gathering, it's about play. And this is a big and very important part of the work we're doing, is this idea about inviting people to engage with space through play. We think about the way that children use space as an inspiration, which is to say that children have no preconceived idea about what architecture or objects should be necessarily. The objects and spaces that for the most part, that we see in our surroundings are designed by adults for adults. So that for a child, things are scaled wrong, the objects feel weird, so they're constantly misusing architecture. In the sense, like as an example, that a table for them might be a fort or a building, and that they could play with it in a way that we wouldn't think of. And so when we can create scenarios like this that invite not only children but adults and everyone to enter space, have a transformative experience that feels outside of your everyday experience, for us, we see that as a win in the sense that we're bringing new people to the conversation. We're bringing people that might not necessarily go to a museum or might not necessarily be interested in our work, or for that matter even think that they're interested in the disciplines of art, design, or architecture. Giving them a little bit of a foot in the door, something that becomes memorable for them and allows them to start to think about why these things are important in our everyday lives. So this is what it looks like. And what happened after this is that we got a call from someone after the DC one closed, and they said, I went to the beach in DC and I want to bring it to my city, and the city was Tampa, Florida, which is a kind of a small city, a relatively small city in southeast in the US. So we brought the project there, and what was important about not only the original version of the project, but each subsequent one, is that really the only thing that kind of stayed were, well, some of the furniture we reused, but most importantly the balls. So there were 1,000,000 of these things, and they're plastic balls, and obviously there's resources that go into making that, and so we knew we didn't want to throw them away, or for that matter even have to recycle them if we didn't have to. Best case scenario is that we could reuse them, which we did. And then the other thing is that the structure itself, which is relatively simple, which you can see is this sort of enclosure, these walls that are built here, and then a sloped floor that recalls a kind of a sand going into the ocean, is all built from rental materials, so construction materials, staging materials, things that we could borrow for the duration of the project and then send back to where they came from to be used again. So after Tampa, it went to Sydney and was part of the Sydney Festival in Australia. I went to Paris and was at the Museum of Decorative Arts there in association with Colette. And not pictured, but it's continued to travel, and most recently was in Chicago and then Detroit in the US. So it's a project that's had a very sort of long life, and it's really the only project we've ever done that we've repeated or restaged, but it continues to be something that's quite popular. Positive and negative, this is a series, just a small object collaboration we did with a company from the UK called 1882. And they're a company that's working with sort of traditional bone china craftspeople in Stoke-on-Trent in London, or in the UK, but bringing new designers to create objects for them. So our piece was based on the idea of a mold and how bone china or any porcelain or ceramics are created, which is to say that they're poured into a mold. And so this was the original object, which is a pretty simple cylindrical vase with this kind of excavated volume cut from it. And then we created a limited edition version, which was basically 1/2 of the mold that created that positive version. So this one we call negative, and it's just a sort of a large object. But one of the reasons that these object collaborations continue to be interesting to us is that it's exciting for us to be able to engage with sort of traditional craft, people that are have a, sort of a proven track record or expertise in a skill or a material that we don't have at all. And so if we can collaborate with them to create this kind of mixture of old and new, we feel that that's something exciting for us. And kind of a similar idea here, in that this was a collaboration with actually Berlin-based brand called Pentatonic, and it's a very interesting company. They're working with 100% recycled material, meaning literally everything from the base material for the build to the smallest hardware to the packaging. All of it is 100% post-consumer waste. We created this these two pieces. There's a chair and a table, which is actually 2 chairs and 2 tables that have been split or fractured down the center. So this is being made, but the chair is really a bench that becomes 2, so you can sit together or apart. And the table is a table that, again, can be moved together or apart depending on how you want to use it. But here you see the table's literally cut through the middle, so it's exposing the kind of structure on the inside. The table's made from aluminum, and the base of the table is part of their existing modular leg system that fits all of their furniture. So it's really just the tops of these pieces that are unique, and the legs can be swapped and reconfigured to make different heights or be added to different pieces. And then the company also has a buyback program so that if you are ever, let's say, finished with the product, that it doesn't need to be put in a landfill, but instead goes back to them to be turned into another new product. Slip chair is a very simple piece. It's a chair that appears to be tipping or slipping. And what's happening here is that there's a kind of a framework of a chair, which we designed for this company called Uva, which is based in Portugal. And the company uses sort of small, traditional Portuguese craftspeople to build their product. And so the chair was sort of loosely inspired and refined in dialogue with the company to have this sort of Portuguese sensibility to it. But the stone comes from Portugal as well. And what you can see here is that you know, the chair recalls the sort of an iconic frame of a chair. So if you think of like a children's drawing of a chair, this is what we thought the chair should look like. It's angled into the ground, which makes it difficult or impossible to sit on or use. So there's this added volume of this marble piece that rests on top that, let's say, restores the function or program of the piece to restore it to a level surface. Topographies is another sort of object scale collaboration. We did this with a company from New York called Calico Wallpaper, and Calico set up this project, which is their business, which is to create non-repeating wallpaper. So when we think of wallpaper, we think of stripes that are repeating pattern. Calico said, let's do it a different way, and they're creating wallpaper that's a unique, scalable, custom, sort of all-over print. So when we started working with them, we knew we wanted to play with this idea of paper itself and also with the idea of architectural depth. So a little bit back to this idea about excavation and creating or discovering unexpected conditions within architecture. So in this case, we were using these layers of paper to create this kind of topographic landscape, which was then, this was the size of the original piece here. It's about 1 by 2 meters, and then it's scanned at a high resolution and enlarged into a very large image, and then it's printed onto a wallpaper. And so the images that you're seeing here are 2-dimensional, they're flat walls, but the piece has this effect of, almost a trompe l'oeil kind of effect of creating this really unexpected depth within the wall. There's just a detail and some images of it installed. Playhouse is a project that I think is another good example of this idea about how children engage with space and how adults engage with space, and how we're interested in finding that intersection between the two, where we can invite both, let's say, children and adults and everybody, again, to enter into a space and to have a meaningful and memorable interaction with that environment. This project was commissioned by the Architecture Biennial in Columbus, Indiana, which is called Exhibit Columbus. And Columbus, Indiana is a very small city in the Midwest of the US that is well known, at least in design and architecture circles, as being a kind of a hotbed of mid-century American architecture. And so when you go to this small town, there's all this incredible examples of incredible architecture from, you know, Eero Saarinen, Alexander Gerard, and more. Sort of everywhere in the town, but what the biennial was concerned with was that citizens of the town, including the next generation, which is to say the children of the town, really didn't have a good understanding or appreciation of the architectural environment that they lived within. And so one of the goals for the commission was how to engage people that live in the town and invite them to think about their built environment, about the architecture that surrounds them in a new way, and connect with it. And so we cited our project on, this is the main street. This is sort of very traditional Americana main street with 2 to 3 story brick buildings. And our project is right here in the middle in this little alleyway. And it's called Playhouse. It's literally a playhouse, but it uses forced perspective, which is a kind of an old optical illusion to create unexpected depth. So the space recedes as it goes to the back, so it appears much longer than it actually is when you look at it from the front. It's made from this kind of slatted louver system, which is relatively simple. Here it is being put in, and this is what it looks like, or looked like. It was installed for the summer. And so passerby, this was open 24 hours a day. People could come by. The siting was relatively significant for us in that the alley where we put this was across the street from a big playground, next to an ice cream shop, and next to the Children's Museum. So it was a sort of nexus of, let's say, parents and children within Columbus. But we also saw it be used by a lot of other people. Loop is a project that we built here, actually, in Seoul 2 years ago. This was here at Ghana Arts Center in the fall of 2017, I believe. And it's another project that's very much about play and inviting people to engage with their environment in unexpected ways. So this project, well, just to walk you through, you come up these stairs here on this, sorry, very difficult to see, but basically you come up the stairs on the left side, and this room, the first room you see, which we'll see images of, is filled with these glass marbles. And then you walk down this hallway and you enter into this larger gallery space, which has the actual structure. But the project is very much inspired by children and children's play, which is to say this famous, well-known toy of a marble run, where you put a marble in and the marble rolls down a track. But what we did was sort of scale that up to architectural scale, to adult size. So this was the first room you saw. You came up these stairs, and this project, as you can see, was commissioned by COS, the fashion brand, so it was in sort of collaboration with them. From this little hole here, a marble would emerge from the wall and roll down this track, and then spill into this pile and sort of flood the floors. So coming back to this idea about using spheres, sort of something we associate with play as a ball. It's also a very sort of strange architectural shape. The idea of something spherical isn't something we often think about in terms of architecture and buildings. So we were invited to pick these marbles up and then bring them into this room. And so this is a 400-meter long marble run. It's made from steel and suspended from the ceiling and was fully automated. So there were these white glass marbles, thousands of them running through the track continuously. But you were also invited to, let's say, place a marble onto the track or remove a marble. and then they would sort of disappear into the floor, only to sort of magically reappear from above. And so it was an environment that was very sort of austere and sort of ethereal, but at the same time very playful and very engaging. Sway is a more recent installation that we did earlier this year in New York. It was commissioned by Lexus for a new building that they built in New York, and there's a gallery space on the top floor of this building. And they had asked us to create an installation that would go in this gallery. And this is what we proposed to them, which was this environment made of spheres. The idea here was to create this environment that was filled. So the spheres are spaced so that they're actually sort of too tight to walk through. So when you walk through them, you're touching them. And what's inside of each of these spheres is this LED light board that's linked to an accelerometer and a sort of a larger program that is what the space looks like when you walk in. As you move through these and touch them, the spheres actually light up, so they're changing in hue and intensity. And as you move through the space, it's creating a kind of a motion trail, as if you could imagine walking through water or tall grass. And that was the sort of the intended effect, is the idea of just sort of brushing through an environment and changing its nature and sort of having this direct one-to-one kind of connection with it. In this case, not only through the tactile relationship of touching these round spheres, but also in seeing the spheres light up, both the ones that you're touching and then the ones that are suspended above to create this kind of reflection. Broken Mirror is an object that we made in collaboration with a company from Italy called Gufram. And so Gufram has a kind of a long and illustrious history in radical design and created a lot of really iconic pieces in the 60s and 70s that were very sort of pop and colorful. And they've recently been working with newer contemporary designers, and so they asked us to create a piece for them, and what we talked about making was a mirror. It was something, they've made a lot of chairs and couches and tables and coat racks and other kinds of objects, but they had never made a mirror. And one of the reasons for that is that the kind of signature material that Gufram uses, which is to say really the only material that this company works with, is a foam. It's a polyurethane foam that's actually soft. And then they coat it with this proprietary coating that makes it resilient. And so the mirror that we designed for them, it's a real mirror, like a glass mirror, but the frame of it is made from this soft foam. So it sort of looks, well, maybe not like a regular mirror, but it looks like a mirror with this kind of portal, but it's actually squishy. So it has this unexpected softness, which is something that, back to the idea about taking things that we understand or expect to be a certain way and then changing something about them. Materiality and really just softness is something that we think about a lot in terms of, we don't expect architecture to be soft, we expect it to be resilient and rigid and stable. But by subverting that a little bit, we're looking to invite these unexpected sort of moments of wonder. So the mirror also has this effect of creating an almost like a portal, or it looks like a little bit like a door to another world. And that led us to this idea about expanding from this single object into a larger environment. So how could we take this one thing and create sort of a spatial installation from it? And this was a project that is still up. It just opened this summer. It's at a design museum outside of Tel Aviv called Holon Design Museum. And it was part of a show that was curated by an Italian curator. And what we did was we created this hall of mirrors, so playing on this sort of traditional fun house environment of walking into a space and seeing your reflection in different ways. And what we did here was divide the gallery into three spaces. So you walk in here on the left side and you walk into a room that's all white, and then you see a wall with 4 mirrors on it. One of those mirrors is not a mirror, it's a door. And you walk into the next room and it's gray and it looks the same way as the first room, except it's gray, and then there's a doorway into the last room, which is the black room. So there's this kind of monochromatic gradient that's happening, and at the same time you're invited to sort of question what's real, what's a reflection, and quite literally sort of go through the looking glass here. So this is actually the last project I want to show you, and I think we'll have plenty of time for hopefully questions, and usually in a smaller format would encourage conversations. I'm not sure how easy that will be here, but we can at least hopefully talk a little bit about what we're doing and how that relates to how people engage with their environments, and how that creating those opportunities for engagement not only with our built surroundings but also with one another, we think is incredibly important. So the last project I'm going to show you is a project called Funhouse, and it's a project that we created last summer in Washington, D.C. We went back to the National Building Museum, who were kind enough to have us back 4 years after we had created the beach. And we built this house in the atrium. And the house was, on one hand, an installation, but it was also an exhibition. And so the project was conceived originally as a kind of a traveling house that would be Snarkitecture's house. We've never designed a house, and we were interested in using the house as a frame for exhibiting our work and thinking about how people could experience projects from the past 10 years of our practice that in many cases had existed for short periods of time in different places in the world. And so how could we bring all these things under one roof in a museum setting that wouldn't be, let's say, drawings, models, photographs, things that we might traditionally associate with exhibition about design or architecture, and as a couple of the participants have alluded to today, that would invite touch. I think we often think about museums as being environments where it's, about looking only and not about interacting or engaging, which I think is continuing to evolve and change, which we think is a great thing. So this is kind of how this project laid out, which is that we put the house, let's see if this is working, but basically right in the middle in this exploded diagram you can see is the house with all of its rooms and structures and parts. In the front we created a front yard in which we created the seating installation, which these enormous oversized letters are a little bit of a reimagining of that first project we looked at, immemorial bowing, which is the big orange letters. And in the back here we created this backyard, which instead of trying to recreate a version of the beach, what we did was we reimagined it into a swimming pool, a sort of traditional kidney-shaped pool. So this is what it looks like in plan, which is a little bit clearer. So we've got the sort of the welcome sign, if you will, in the front yard. You walk into this house with its kind of picket fence, and it's laid out in a way that might recall or reflect what we think of as a traditional house, but each room's been sort of replaced with a different Snarkitecture project that we, again, sort of either recreated or reinstalled for this exhibition. The other thing that was really interesting to us about the house as a kind of a frame was going back to this idea about a universal experience. We all grew up in a house of some sort, and we have associations with that house that is the house of your childhood, but also maybe your current home. And there's something about being invited into someone else's home that we felt that was very sort of personal and created this direct connection, but also something very uncanny and almost uncomfortable, the idea of sort of creeping around someone else's house and opening the closets and seeing what's in there. So this is this project being built. Here's Playhouse from Columbus, which we reinstalled there. The facade. We didn't look at this project, but these strange little inflated cylinders here are from a pavilion that we did for Design Miami. So this is kind of what it looked like. What we had in the front, which actually, maybe I'll just go back to that real quick. Sorry. Is something that we wanted to look like a house, which is, again, to say almost like a child's drawing of a house. So we sort of took this almost generic American vernacular of this kind of colonial farmhouse and recreated it in this sort of solid all-white material. And so from the front, you're seeing what looks like a regular house, but as you move around the sides, you're seeing that it's quite literally broken away to reveal the internal structure, the internal framing of this building. So in here you can see this is actually a different sort of earlier version of the Marble Run project that we put inside of what was the playroom of the house. We've got a Snarkitecture. This is a little mini basketball hoop we did in collaboration with a brand from LA called Kill Spencer. We see the facade sort of breaking away. This is the backyard here, so we've got the swimming pool, we've got the playhouse from Exhibit Columbus, and we've got two projects here, one of which is the pavilion I mentioned from Design Miami called Drift, which was these inflated white cylinders, and then underneath that is a seating installation originally from Complex Con in Los Angeles called Pillow Fort, and I think there's another photo of that here. So the front entrance of the house is based on a project we did in New York, a very early project for Snarkitecture, which was called Dig, and it was from Storefront for Art and Architecture. And this was one of the first times we were really getting into this idea about architecture of excavation, which is sort of a reversal of how we normally think of architecture as being a series of assemblies or constructions. What we were interested in is going back to a very kind of ancient or primal idea about digging, quite literally removing material to create a space for inhabitation. Through here, you're seeing the broken mirror at the end of the hall. We didn't touch on it in this talk, but one of the other areas we work in quite a bit is fashion and retail, and for that, the ceiling of the hall here, which let's see if there's another photo, is made out of these cast shoes, which are an element of a project, stores that we do for a brand called Kith. Here's the marble run in the playroom. Here's the bathroom. What we're seeing here is a piece called Beach Chair, which is quite literally, well, it's a chair, but it's also based on the original mock-up we made for the beach, which is an art crate filled with the material from the beach. On the wall here is a collaboration we did with a clothing company from New York called Print All Over Me, and these are architectural camouflage. So in this case, you're seeing basically an all-over print of hex tile hanging on a hex tile wall. The kitchen back here, which I think there's an image of, was a sort of assemblage of objects. This room was a recreation of an installation we did also with COS in Milan in 2015, which was a room full of these fabric ribbons. Here you've got a little glimpse of the seating installation called Pillow Fort, which is based on this sort of building of literal fort, like a play fort out of couch cushions. So we created this rather large mound of them that allows you to repurpose them, reconfigure them. Here's a shot of Playhouse as you enter the back. And this is the seating installation in the front. Again, the letters, in this case, rather than being made out of concrete, we made them out of upholstery, so they're soft seating. They're something that kids and everybody else would sort of use this as a gathering place to sit and meet and climb and play, etc. So I'll leave it at that. I think we have plenty of time for some questions or conversation, so I'd welcome anything you guys have. Thank you.
Thank you.